Yes.
And you guys have met with her.
Okay, guys, I think I'm going to do a quick introduction. We're on Facebook Live. I believe my viewers are there. I hope. It seems like it's some kind of different interface. Right?
Hello.
Facebook Live, what you got? 1, 2 people, they live in? They'll join.
Yeah, okay, they're
Let's
tuning
see
in.
if I can these are our guests today. Say your names again, because I don't want to butcher the name.
Hannah. Niketa.
And they're going to be
NTA.
NTA, the hot topic of the day. NTA.
Thank you, Anton. So you've seen our guests. We're going to be talking about National Teachers Academy first and foremost in the next hour, 10 to 11 a.m. National Teachers Academy is a high-performing, predominantly black school that CPS is attempting to close. So we're going to start the conversation there. Join in. You can call us at 773-591-1690. We're talking about education equity, and so you'll be hearing from our guests in a minute. So join the conversation.
They trying to get me this morning.
In the spirit, right?
Spirit, boy. They trying to take me back to 44 King Drive.
Man.
That's a fact.
Good morning, Chicago. Thank you for tuning in on this Monday morning. This is Labor Day. I'm your host for the morning, Amara Enyia. You can catch me every Tuesday at 9:20 a.m. and 5:20 p.m. with my commentary. I just want to give a shout out to our DJ for the morning, to be young, gifted, and black.
Can I just chime in right
Please
quick?
do.
We have just a, not even a moment of silence, but a moment of uplift for, a real pioneer, our queen warrior mother who we lost the other day, Patricia Hill,
Yes.
aka known as Mama Pat for many of us.
Mm-hmm.
So sending love and positive vibrations to my extended family, to Ron, to Zinga, to the whole Hill family. So thinking of her, because I know that she's always on top of the business.
Yeah.
So I think that would be a good segue into what we're going to talk about today.
Definitely. This has been kind of a challenging time as we think about those who really paved the way for us. And I think it is a good segue into this next segment where we're talking about issues of education equity or inequity that we're seeing in Chicago. For those of you who are just now tuning into WVON, I'm joined in the studio with my co-host, my brother Anton Seals, who is going to be really just providing his insights, especially in these next couple of topics, where we're really going to be delving into some of the issues that we've seen happening in Chicago, and in particular in Chicago public schools. I also have two guests with me in the studio who are critically important to this conversation about education equity. So we have Niketa Brar, who is one of the co-founders of Chicagoans United for Equity, and we also have Hannah El-Amin, who is one of the parents at National Teachers Academy. We're talking about a school, a high-performing school that happens to be predominantly black in the city of Chicago. And for those of you who are not aware of NTA, National Teachers Academy, located in South Loop, CPS is closing or attempting to close this high-performing, predominantly black school in South Loop in the city of Chicago. And so we're talking about why that is. And that's why we have these two guests in the studio. If you want to call in, the number to call in and join this discussion is 773-591-1690. But let's talk about that. So Niketa and Hannah, I want to give you an opportunity just to provide some background to what is happening at National Teachers Academy so that our listeners really understand what CPS is doing, what the city is trying to do.
Absolutely. So yes, National Teachers Academy is, as you said, predominantly African American school. It's also predominantly low income, 80% African American, 80% low income, and it is a high performing school as well. It is actually one of only 16 schools in the entire 600 plus Chicago public school systems that is rated, that has that high academic rating, as well as is considered a well organized school. So it is of great value, I think, to our community. It should be of great value to the education landscape in Chicago. And it's definitely not something that we can sacrifice when that number should be much higher than 16 to start with, and NTA is one of those 16. And unfortunately right now, CPS has put forth a proposal to close the school. They are calling it a conversion because they would like to turn it into a high school for the 700 students that are there who will no longer be able to attend there as elementary school students. We would call this a closing.
And Niketa, can you provide a little bit of background of how you got involved in this particular issue with National Teachers Academy?
Yeah, definitely. So I actually serve as the local school council community representative for National Teachers Academy, as well as Phillips High School, which is right down the street. So I'm in a unique position because I'm actually trying to advocate for two schools in this situation. And that's important because CPS would like to have you believe that this is about integration, that by shutting down NTA and bringing the kids over to a larger South Loop Elementary School, that they're somehow integrating two communities that are otherwise very segregated. But here's the reality. One, this is not being done for the elementary school integration because South Loop Elementary School does not have any one racial group in the majority. So they're actually pretty well racially integrated. However, they're only about 30% low income. So we would say that economically they are a pretty segregated group. Second, NTA is also working on integration. The way we think about integration is equitable integration. That means that all the students of color that are in the school stay at the school. And all the empty seats that we have, if other people want to come into the school, we'll always welcome anybody else. But the school is built specifically for serving the kids of the ICKE's projects. We always think of those kids first as our legacy, basically. And so when we think about segregation, what's really happening is that this is segregation at the high school level. The high school level, because there are families in the high school boundary of Phillips Academy who choose not to send their children to Phillips. And they don't want to send their kids to Phillips, and they also don't really want to partake in the selective enrollment process for CPS. I don't fault those parents for that. I think the selective enrollment process is pretty arduous, it's ridiculous, it creates a very high-stress situation on our children. But to say that you don't want to participate in that process and you deserve your own high school is actually a pretty privileged statement to make. So that's how Chicagoans United for Equity got involved, because initially it was actually just a few parents, myself, a few parents from NTA, a few parents from South Loop Elementary, who sat down and said, we want to work on bringing our community together. And that's really grown into a movement where we're looking at schools around Chicago and how we could best support what we call equitable and sustainable integration.
So I want to just sort of unpack this, because I've been following this story from the very beginning, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised at this point with some of the antics that come out of Chicago public schools on issues like this.
What, the overplay for the underplay in Chicago?
The overplay for the underplay, Anton. I mean, this is the way that this situation is playing out. It just speaks to that. It's the epitome of that. This notion of diversity. Now, the question that I'll pose for our viewers on Facebook, for our listeners, and for you in the studio, has there ever been a time where there was a predominantly white, high-performing school that was closed because it wasn't diverse enough, that was closed because of this argument that it needed to be diverse? Can you imagine a scenario where you have a high-performing, level 1, predominantly white school in the city of Chicago that is then closed, and the argument that they use for closing that school is that it wasn't diverse?
I'll put it right back to you, Amara. Less than a mile away from NTA is Healy Elementary School. That's an 80% Asian population. But nobody seems to be taking issue with the fact that that's not a very diverse school.
Precisely. And Anton, I don't know if you had a response.
I mean, I was going to ask in terms of like just some kind of just sort of audience of like, so we can kind of have a placement of like, when did this all kind of start from your point of view? Like, where did this jump off begin? Where, you know, you have this high performing school, right? And we were just talking right before we got on in terms of even the history of getting NTA, right? But fast forward us to like where we are now, where the fight became like, that's number one. And then the other question is, talk about who is this new population? Because again, this new neighborhood, South Loop, is a new neighborhood that was built with intention by the former Mayor Daley. It was an intention. So I think a lot of this has to have context, because that is the legacy of Mayor Daley after the late Mayor Harold Washington and Eugene Sawyer, you know, served. There was this breakup around what to do next, and his big signature was the plan for transformation, right? And so this is kind of all set in that context. Can you talk a little bit about that?
You know, I think that's a really good question, because it highlights one of the major issues with this proposal, and that all voices haven't been present at the table. So to answer the question about when we were first made aware of the plan, so I would say sometime approximately in May, we were given a notice by CPS that the boundaries of our school were going to be, that they were going to shrink the boundaries of our school, which would obviously cause under-enrollment of the school. And we called it at that time and said the only reason that you would shrink the boundaries of the school would be to intentionally destabilize the school, because you would like to potentially use it as a high school. So then we held our own town hall meeting to discuss the concerns over shrinking the boundaries and how it would destabilize our school. And at precisely 3 hours before our town hall meeting, CPS issued a letter admitting what we were prepared to get ready to call them out on, that what we knew was really the true underlying plan. And what we found out was that although they kind of tried to play transparency in that moment by submitting that letter or releasing that letter 3 hours before the meeting, we're well aware of the fact that the process began much earlier than that. For example, we have a representative from Chinatown who put a message on Facebook. She represents an organization in Chinatown and said, "Cat's out of the bag. This is what we've been working on for the past year." 1 year. Remind you, no NTA families have been involved in this conversation. And we recently received emails from Alderman Pat Dowell to Barbara Byrd Bennett as early as 2015 requesting the conversion of NTA to a high school, all while she was coming over for photo ops and everything else, that this has been going on, this kind of behind the scenes agenda to try to destabilize or convert the school into a high school has been going on for a while with no NTA voices at the table.
And let's talk about that email for a second, because that email puts in such clear terms exactly how the city of Chicago practices modern day redlining on our kids. In that email, it specifically says, it was sent in April of 2015, and it's an email from Alderman Pat Dowell to Barbara Byrd Bennett. And what she says in that email is, a few days ago at an Easter egg hunt, and we then backdated and found it was literally 10 days before the email was sent, at an Easter egg hunt, the mayor met with the president of Prairie District Neighborhood Alliance, which is a wealthy group of property owners in the South Loop. And he promised the president of Prairie District Neighborhood Alliance that NTA would become a high school. I mean, think about that for a second. I don't care whether you win or lose under this proposal. Is that the way you want your government making decisions for you?
So basically, it preempted any engagement or any input from the community, those who would be most affected, meaning the parents at NTA. And this is the kind of sort of backdoor backroom conversations that are held with those who are politically connected. And I'm going to speak candidly because I just have to speak candidly. When we're talking about who makes the decisions in the city of Chicago and the motives behind those decisions, and then you juxtapose that with the justifications that they provide once the cat is out of the bag, as you stated, and once things have been discovered or found out. It speaks to this lack of good faith and really lack of respect for the community, just in terms of the process. I mean, I'm not sure if any of the listeners have been really following the narrative in this case. And Niketa, what you're talking about is basically emails that were going on behind the scenes that were explaining what they were going to do before it was done, and you guys are coming in at the back end, having just discovered that this plan has already been put in place.
Well, at every step of the way, we found out about this because our parents pushed to find out about this. There was absolutely, they didn't even make the attempt to be transparent once the cat was out of the bag. So the way this really went down was we followed the news, like really followed the news. WBEZ reported back in 2016 that South Loop Elementary was getting this brand new shiny annex because they were over capacity. And it was part of a larger story on how new school construction furthers race and class segregation. And so we said, wait a second, we have capacity here. If they wanted to bring some of their kids over, we would be welcoming to them to come and join us and build an actually integrated community, right? And when we reached out to South Loop Elementary, we got drinks with them, but there was no interest in anything further than that. So that was 2016. Now fast forward to 2017, around the springtime, we started following the news and we realized, wait a second, they're going to get, instead of $9 million for that annex, they're getting $63 million for that annex. That's a whole lot, that's a 7-time increase, right? And that's when we said, wait, how are you getting a $63 million annex? And we started pulling and saying, why would they fund that at a time where CPS is saying we can't keep the doors open until the end of June? Why would they do that unless there's something bigger at play here? And so every step of the way, so that's when we showed up at Alderman Pat Dowell's community meeting, and only because our parents, they didn't want to talk about it at all, but in the question and answer session, people raised their hand and they said, what's going on? And only in that public forum did they then start to say, well, your boundaries are actually going to change. And we said, wait. How are we finding that out now? Oh, by the way, that was the day after they got that annex approved by City Council. So it's, at every step of the way, it's been because our parents have been on the front lines pushing them that any of this information has come out, and only because we put the math together behind the scenes where we realized, wait, you change our boundary, you just cut out 300 kids from our school, so that means you want to close our school.
So at the end of the day, it sounds like, I mean, in full disclosure, I've known Pat Dow for years, and if she's out there, it'd be good to have her call so we can, have this balanced conversation to give her point of view around, some of these issues. And given that this is with her second term as the elected official, but I think one of the things that you're lifting up is the way that Chicago has done business, continues to do business in this way. It becomes very, it is a kind of a nefarious way that it kind of feels like, I know a lot of the parents, I know several like godchildren who go to NTA who were caught off guard. One is that I think for many black families, Latino families in particular, it's very hard to find a good place to send your child. I mean, literally the Chicago Public Schools has become like the Hunger Games at kindergarten, right? to get in your child in a good school. Absolutely. So once you find a good school, that whole kind of like, we need to reconfigure where to go. And the other thing I think it speaks to is that, when we talk about this Prairie District, that is a brand new neighborhood. Right, I went to school in that area. That was my track to school. Right, Ignatius is on Roosevelt Road. That entire swath of land has been built out in the last 20 years. Right, and so that has attracted a new kind of privilege. So I look at it as it is definitely a race thing, and it's also a class thing. Right, because many people who are there are both. It is a diverse community. So I think this goes back to your point around when we say diversity, what are we really talking about, right? When we use these words, people at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding, right? We have an example now that you got a school, so that means that how many students got enough to figure out where they're going to go to school next year? And what's their option now? So that would be my question to you, with this now being said that the school's going to close, what happens for those parents?
Well, so that's a good question. So,
You know, students, right?
there have been several variations of this plan that have been presented. So the very first variation was most definitely the most awful. So what they said was that they would accept into the new South Loop Elementary School the kids in the gifted program and the kids who live only within the neighborhood boundaries. And so that left is 300 students that had no idea where they were going to go. This is actually the issue in particular that I highlighted at the first town hall meeting. And so because they were trying to present this message like we're taking care of everyone, but there were still 300 children that were left with no options. And so they have shifted it a bit and given some delays and kind of talked about like kind of a transition period. But the bottom line is, like you said, your school is a home away from home, and it's really difficult to find a school at which your children can thrive and where they can feel that they are engaged in a way that they feel supported and dignified. And NTA is that home for these families, and there has been lots of displacement for the families at NTA already. And this, every time there is a displacement, research shows that the children struggle academically for up to 2 years after that. And again, for many families at NTA, this will be the third time. They've already closed, when CPS closed the largest round of school closings a few years ago, in Alderman Dowell's own district, that's where most of the closings occurred. The largest amount were in her own district.
That's right.
So I want to unpack that a little bit more, just the sort of the historical context behind the school closings, how it's affected this community, and why this is the latest iteration of a pattern, quite frankly, that has been meted out in many of our communities. And we have several callers on the line, so I want to get them on the line with their questions and comments. For those of you who are watching and listening, I'm in the studio with, of course, my co-host Anton Seals, also with Hannah El-Amin and Niketa Brar, who are from Chicagoans United for Equity and National Teachers Academy, which is the school that CPS has decided is the latest in line to be closed. It is a level 1 high-performing school that is also predominantly black in the city's South Loop neighborhood. So we're talking education equity. We're going to take a quick break. If you do have questions, you can call in 773-591-1690. We will await your calls, and we will be right back.
Oh, it's oh so much. Jesus Christ. These supposed to be your friends. Right? These are supposed to be your friends. This is the problem with the whole Democratic neoliberal onslaught.
Yeah.
Like, these are your friends.
Yeah.
Like, they failed to even understand, like, this whole closing of 50 schools was not just about the actual closing of the 50 schools.
Right.
It was
I don't know how
about,
to use it.
to your point,
so you
are disrupting,
put the phone
displacing school
fit it.
families and
You can
history.
turn it if you want.
Right?
That way you can just sit
So
in the
now
car.
what you have is
Can I
that
turn
you
it?
got in many
If I turn it on the
areas.
side, does it?
One, we haven't talked about.
Sorry, guys, I
why
have to get
populations-
this together. No, you're good. No, you're good. I was talking
Why
with viewers so you
populations
can
have
see
decreased.
some things shifting.
in such high numbers, right? That's why Pat Dowell's ward, that was the ward of the statewide corridor.
Well, you asked, okay, so I'm gonna push you even more.
And you also have
further.
this
It's
one.
more than the schools, more than the students, more than their families. It's about the
might
entire
actually be-
residential population
I brought this
of
one
the
in
entire
too.
neighborhood. So you think about 30,
Okay.
Yeah.
you displace 1,700 children. What does that do to the families, communities, housing market of that area?
Right. Multiply that times a family of 4.
Exactly. Exactly. So I mean,
Yeah, you're just gonna have to.
if you want to keep asking why we don't see development in certain areas, well,
Okay.
what are you doing to invite development? The first thing you do is anchor a community through a great school, through a great,
A
community
public.
asset.
So that gets to where I was going with is like the notion that the public school, what the public school system was created for, seems to be under threat by privateers, people who have a philosophy that it is more than just, it is not just a public. So it seems like there was this breakdown between post-World War II and we started talking about the civil rights or desegregation. This is at the core of like where we are right now. It's a philosophy, right? Because public schools worked just fine when they were pretty much all white. Right? You could do everything. So then we start adding other people, in particular black people, Latinos, into the mix of what the public square is. Then there becomes a bifurcation of all of these things. It's like, it's insane. But we're supposed to just go along, and what happens is families have to make the choice.
Right.
at the end of the day what's best for you as an individual.
My phone is this way.
Right? So that's where, as a government, they can kind of say, well, you choose this. But there is no investment in the public, that notion of this public institution. And we know that that's kind of a misnomer, because when you go to the northwest side of the city, same kind of economic background in Belmont Craig and Ravenswood, some of these, they got public schools. High performing public schools.
Yeah, now it's on its side.
They're not in jeopardy of like fighting to hold on to their school.
Amara's question of like when did they last try to close them?
Are we on Facebook Live?
Yes.
Never.
No, never.
Never.
Wouldn't even be having this conversation.
Not even having. And so that's at the heart of like the attitudes and behaviors of those who are in leadership, who say that we have to make these hard choices. The hard choice is between a kind of not disorganized but unorganized group of families who, because they're pulling from all over, so they're not neighborhood based anymore, versus a new, wealthier neighborhood based organization.
Yep.
Right, that's what we have
And
now.
it comes down to who is valued. Again, it always comes down to who is valued in the city. So of course, you can have this prairie district neighborhood relatively new that came on the scene, but because they have access to political clout and money and so on and so forth, they're valued more so than the kids and families who the school was originally designed to serve.
Because now they're the residents.
Precisely.
Right?
And also, I mean, at the end of the day, just in life in general, right, you push around the people who you feel like you can get away with it, right? And that's the sad thing, that's the bottom line. They're not trying it with those schools, because for one thing, if it's a high-performing school, it should be left alone, leave to thrive and let it do its thing, right? But they feel that when it comes to this population, that they know that they feel that there's little that they can do to push back.
And for all of my viewers on Facebook, you can call in, leave your comments and questions also if you want to contribute to this conversation. We're talking about education equity. 773-591-1690 is the call-in, but also I'll be reading some of your comments on what's happening with National Teachers Academy, what's happening in CPS more generally in terms of who's valued and who's not. That's the question that we're discussing. So leave your questions and comments if you haven't been following this situation. We're going to be talking about it for the next half hour, so stay tuned. Good morning, Chicago. You are listening to WVON 1690. I'm your host on this Labor Day, Amara Enyia. You can find me on or listen to me on WVON every Tuesday at 9:20 a.m. and 5:20 p.m. with my commentary on the latest in policy and politics across the city, state, and the nation. I'm joined today in the studio with my brother Anton Seals, who's holding it down with me on Labor Day. Anton, how are you on this?
Well, now I'm
Great
fired
day.
up.
Yes.
After my coffee and a gas donut on a Labor Day. And I'm hearing this like, man, this is like for real.
Yes.
Like, we're in the thick of things.
Yes. So it really is. This is a conversation that we all need to care about and we all need to be passionate about because it's happening across the city. This is part and parcel of CPS and City of Chicago MO. This is what they do, and this is why this conversation is so important. We have in the studio with us this morning, we have Hannah El-Amin. She is a parent at National Teachers Academy. We also have Niketa Brar, who is one of the co-founders of Chicagoans United for Equity. And they're joining us to talk about what's been happening in CPS with their attempt to close National Teachers Academy. And right before we left on the break, I was referencing some callers. So I want to get some of those calls on the line, but I also want us to begin to unpack more fully this notion of value and who has power and who is it perceived does not have power. That's the question I want to ask. So, but first we're going to go to the lines. I have Gerald on the line. Good morning, Gerald. Well, Gerald, I really appreciate your bringing some of that context, because it is true. This happened down in Beverly with the closing, the attempt, and it was the alderman was involved in it. It's actually eerily similar to this situation where there were some backdoor conversations taking place, an attempt to close a school, predominantly black, well-performing school, to cater to residents from Mount Greenwood. And so again, it's this issue of power and who has power and who has the ability to push those kinds of decisions, and who ends up taking a hit as a result of those decisions.
Yeah, and I think we just have to, and I want you guys to elaborate. I mean, we have to kind of call this what it is. I mean, at the end of the day, what you have in terms of the city, what it sounds like, it's not the end of the day yet, so the fight still continues, right? But nonetheless, we see often that people of color are often forced to want or desire, like, where there's a majority or predominantly white school is seen as better. What I find interesting is that the inverse is not true. And this speaks to the core of what we talk about white supremacy, and we got to call this all the way out now. I mean, we got an orange president, right? So we got a real serious, like, at the end of the day, like, you could call this not no longer like these backroom conversations. Like, what it is a move by the white established class. Now, whether or not and it's a mentality, as Dick Gregory, it's not just a color, it's the way that you think about how you see the world. So in this case, those white children could have went to NTA.
Absolutely.
Right? They could have went to this Kellogg school, but that usually doesn't happen, because what has been thrusted for most of us in this country is that when you have something white, it usually is better, right? That's what it kind of connotates in a way, that you have something better. And is that some of the similar cases that is there this racial tension around who gets to expand and make this for ours without having to say that? But I think what we have to force them to say, you need to say that, right? Because that you're participating in the continuation of white supremacy and institutional racism.
And also, it's the issue of whenever it comes to things like diversity or integration, the onus is always put on the marginalized group.
Yes.
To have to pack up and move to a community, a white community, to have to shut your school down and be shuffled over to a predominantly white school. Again, you will not see a predominantly white, high-performing school being closed and those students and families forced to find some way to get themselves into another school.
Right.
So
and
we
if
have
your VON listeners know of one, please let us know.
Exactly, and I may be wrong. I highly doubt it, but I have not, in the history of our, and just more broadly speaking, when it comes to public policy, our public policy for the last 60 years, I would argue, has always put the onus on people of color who've already been marginalized and living in communities that have been disinvested to now have to pack up and get to where the people who are valued live. Because again, this is an issue of who is valued. There's no community that says they want messed up schools. There's no community that says that they do not want access to parks, access to food, access to safety. Everyone wants the same things. However, when you have communities where certain groups are not valued, you see the disinvestment, the requisite disinvestment, which looks like your schools being closed, which looks like no investments in infrastructure, which looks like redlining by banks, so no access to capital for economic investment. Those are all things that occur in communities where the people are not valued. So then what we say is, to show you how we really don't value you, even when you have a high-performing school, we're still going to close your school and force you to now have to shuffle around and find another school to quote-unquote integrate because diversity.
I'm so glad that you brought up that point and talk about the attitudes that are out there, because I think that when we speak of these attitudes, some people act as if it's just in our imagination, right? That this has nothing to do with perpetuating, ideas of white supremacy. No one here is a racist, et cetera, et cetera. And we've always said, even if it's not racism, at the very least, there is classism at play here. But I want to bring some very specific...
But there's also racism.
There is also a play here, exactly. And I want to bring some very specific examples. When South Loop was having an issue of overcrowding several years ago, they did ask to use some space at NTA for their classrooms. In that proposal, they asked for separate entrances, They ask for separate ending and start times. They basically ask for their children to have to never come in contact with the students of NTA. I'll give you one other example.
The teachers.
The teachers.
The teachers were supposed to have separate parking lots because you couldn't trust the teachers to be next to the other teachers.
And in the same organization that reached out to Mayor Rahm Emanuel for this request, Prairie District Neighborhood Alliance, there was a comment on that on their page where someone said, when it's 80%, with a school that's 80% low income, whether it's a good school, even if it's a good school, is there any wonder why we hesitate to send our children there? What does that even mean?
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and take this call. I want to get some of our callers on the line. Pam, thank you for calling in. Pam, thank you so much for your insight and for your candor.
That's something you could do.
Right. No, Pam, you've said it. You've said it. Just being candid. This is about leadership. This is about the philosophy of the leadership in this city that has institutionalized inequity and that perpetuates inequity as a matter of policy.
But then calls it. See, this is where I think we have to be really mindful. But then calls it equity.
Yes.
Right.
So it's also a hijacking and plagiarizing, appropriation of your language.
Yes.
They talk as if they are with you.
Yes. But everything that they do says otherwise.
And the proof in terms of like because we're having this dialogue about this, and I think you're right. It's like you gotta, what I've seen in terms of what the actual deposit, what the impact has been. I think that's what we're all talking about, right? Is that's what the the end result is.
Yes, yes, and I mean, I think Pam made several points that we really need to highlight, and some of the comments that are coming in. Phil said, stand up or get punked, and this is exactly a case of where we're standing up to make sure that we don't succumb to the repeated attempts to undermine our communities and our schools. It's also this notion of really speaking candidly about what they tell us versus what we know. So they might say this is all about diversity, et cetera, but I know because I was involved in another process in another part of the district where there could have been an opportunity for diversity, but they refused to be involved, right? So you're getting all of these mixed messages that speak to the fact that there's no interest in the philosophy that we're talking about, equity and access to a high quality education. Because if that were the case, then you would not see the level of inequitable funding that you see right here in the school district. So you have a school district that went down to Springfield to claim that it was a violation of constitutional rights because of the inequity at the state level of funding. Yet, in that same school district, you see the disparity in funding for our kids depending on where, by virtue of the neighborhood you live, determines the quality of education that you receive. And Pam also brought up this notion of undermining the notion of public schools. So we've actually demonized the notion of having a public school. It's questionable whether or not we actually value as a public good.
That's right.
Public education.
That's
fundamentally.
Fundamentally.
Like I cannot stand on the notion that we actually value public education as a public good. And that is a frightening thing. And it's evident in the latest school funding bill that was just passed, where it's not enough to say, okay, we've got a more equitable funding formula. No, you had to inject a mechanism in there to continue to siphon public funds away from public schools.
I mean, well, that's the neoliberal kind of push too. Is around that. Then you insert language of choice.
Right.
Right. So when you start talking about America, you're talking about individual choices, right? And so that then always comes back to your own values, right, and your family, as the individual. And I think that's because it becomes a little bit, and that's where it becomes conflated, because it then puts the onus on families, right? Because families are trying to make the best choices for their children. So oftentimes what ends up happening is that you're going to choose what you think is best or better for your children. So it'd be insane for us to sit here and think that, I'm just going to send my child to the regular public school because I believe in these kind of larger, and I don't believe that that's the best for my child, right? But I think when you start unpacking, what do you think is the best for your child? It gets because that gets really hairy. And I think these forces, unfortunately, have manipulated the public and not, tried to advocate on behalf of the public interest, right? So why is there shrinking? So what we were told with Renaissance 2010 was that it would save money. Like, this is important. Like, context is important. Mayor Daley had to take control of the board of the school, of the Board of Education, because they needed to save money, right? And we're going back almost close to 30 years, over 25 years now, right? So when they got control of it, what has happened since you have had mayoral control of the school system, right? And what was pushed after that was this whole notion. And now, just last week, we get the kind of final wrappings of education reform, which is now vouchering out the system, right? Which will allow for people who have money to get tax credits for giving you a scholarship for a certain amount of money, right, to go to a private school.
Right.
So you're going to cannibalize the regular public school, now your quote-unquote public charter schools, right? And now now they're saying for the individual, now you can choose all these things. But at the end of the day, your taxes are still going to support all of these things.
Right.
Well, and they're giving you a tax credit for it. So, when do I get a tax credit for, putting in money to Planned Parenthood or to any organization I support? I can't.
So I have a caller that I want to bring on the line, and he has a question for both of you. So we've got Robert on the line.
Yeah,
yes.
Caller.
The two different races, right? Now, we can need to connect the dots. When we talk about value, there was a value placed on people brought here and changed big cotton and tobacco. Once the cotton gin was invented, the value and the individuals who were brought here was no longer a value, it was
Thank you, Robert, for your comment. So the notion of a villain, they need a villain, and who do they villainize? I think that's an excellent point. We've also got comments coming in talking about the end game, the complete privatization of education. So again, this fundamental question of whether we see public education as a public good, that is the question that we're faced with. We have Robbie on the line who's asking who you've talked to in management. Robbie, thank you for your comment.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I've heard representatives from NTA on various shows on WVON. My question is, have you talked to any of the major newspapers? I think this story needs broader public exposure because some of the things that were said today, like going in you had these optional plans, one where you would go in separate doors, where the parking lot would be separate. These are very controversial, racially biased kinds of things that have gone on, and I think that you really need to, have you talked to the Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune and some of the other entities? I'm curious about that.
So the question is for our listening audience is who have you talked to in management and really getting a more broad coverage of this story? And in media. Thank you.
That's a great question. So we have been reaching out to media outlets. I think this is a place where our listeners can actually help us. If you want to get on Twitter and start tweeting to them, because we've actually shared some of this information and additional emails with them that we've discovered through our FOIA requests. But unfortunately, with all the air in the room being sucked out because of the SB1 bill that just passed last week, all of the education reporters really focused on that. So we're hoping that in the next few weeks we actually get coverage. And if you would like to tweet out to those reporters who you would like to see covering the story, that might actually create some buzz. The other thing I heard one of the listeners ask is, how could we help? The number one thing you can do right now is pick up the phone and call. Tomorrow is the first day of school. The mayor's phone number, if you're ready for it, is 312-744-9733. The mayor's phone number is 312-744-9733. How great would it be for him to welcome back all the children into the CPS public school system and get a whole bunch of phone calls and messages from your listeners right now, letting him know that we're not letting him off the hook for what he's trying to do to NTA. And the other thing you can do is, we are having an event. So Chicagoans United for Equity, we're trying to bring people together. The whole point of Chicagoans United for Equity is to say, you can't pick on one school at a time. We're all going to fight back. That's what Chicago and being united is all about, right? So our next event is called Fighting Today's Jim Crow, Standing Up for Equity in Your Backyard. And that's going to be on Wednesday, September 20th at 6 p.m. at Quinn Chapel. That's right in the South Loop area. You can go to We Are NTA on Facebook and find out more about that event and other ways to support us.
We have Kevin on the line who is talking about systematic gentrification. Kevin, you're on.
How you doing?
Good. Thank you for your call.
Everyone else. There's this institutionalized genocide going on, and it seems that no matter what we're trying to do, whether we're in the public school sector and performing great, whether we're in an underperforming school, not performing so well, it doesn't matter. They have a plan in place in order to eliminate us. They want us out of the area, and the first thing that you do is go after the institutions, because when you want to replace a class of people, you first eliminate them. They did that when they eliminated the projects. Now they're eliminating the schools. Now they're creating a whole new infrastructure to bring in a whole new class of people, and that's what's going on right now. The only thing that I think that we can do whenever we're being overtaxed and underrepresented, there's a need for revolution. You know, we have to do something. I think we need to take our public school sector and private school sectors and create something of our own, and it has to be an African-centered curriculum surrounding it, because they're not in the business of helping us in no way, shape, or form, so we're going to have to help ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. And that's Kevin's comments are reflected in some of the comments from our Facebook viewers as well, and just really talking about the bottom line of CPS. There's this notion, the sentiment that it's not actually about educating our kids. So if that is the frame of reference, then how do we then proceed? We have seen, again, we've talked about the closure of schools and communities back in 2012. We're talking about the fact that the reasons that were given for why those schools were closed. And in this case, we have a predominantly black, high-performing school that's also still going to be closed. So what is the end game? It doesn't appear that the goal is to educate our kids. And so that being the case, how then do we proceed? How then do we move forward? What does that look like for us who are seeing the systematic dismantling of public education, where we can't even get to the issue of what's happening in the classroom because the notion of even having a public school is under threat. This is a very, if we're not paying attention, if we weren't paying attention before, then we certainly have to be paying attention now, because everything is moving in that direction, including this legislation that's being touted as a win. But if you look closely, I characterize it as a short-term, quote-unquote, win for long-term loss.
I mean, I think, what we're really talking about is, these kind of larger forces around what's happening, a vision for a city. And I think that's where the kind of pushback, and it's not just within this last administration. I mean, it's been in effect in play, I would say, for at least the last 25 plus years,
Yeah.
And the big thing is, like, in terms of like what we can do. I mean, elections have consequences. They do. I mean, it's not just about electing a certain person. You're also electing an ideology.
Exactly.
And they're bringing in bureaucrats and administrators who believe in that kind of ideology. So I think, in closing, like, what else do you think would be helpful to you all as you all are trying to, save the school? What, is there a plan B? Is this a done deal?
And before we go into that, because I want to make sure that you have enough time to share just some last thoughts, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back and talk about Anton's question and some final thoughts on this issue. For those of you who are listening, I'm Amara Enyia, hosting on WVON 9 to 12. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back.
Happy Labor Day from the
Oh, cool. I thought she was counting down like her. I was like, okay.
No, you actually had perfect timing.
I saw her do like this. I was like,
The ways that people can help is ever evolving. There's always a new aspect. The letter campaign, for example, you just heard.
That's what we think is right now.
Right.
We basically realize, like, the city is so corrupt that we can't rely on our city people to, like, stand up for us.
Yeah.
Right, because our alderman is complicit in this plan.
Yeah.
And what we've launched is basically a campaign to get our state level legislators involved. We launched a letter writing campaign in 3 days. We had over 450 letters sent out.
to like Maddie Hunter and
Maddie Hunter, to Sonia Harper, and actually we had backers. We already primed all of them. We've given them, we had to sit down with them, give them information on what's going on. The good thing is that most of these folks are already in support of us, but what they're looking for is something where they can back up and say, well, so many hundred of my people are
They need
calling me about
political
this
cover.
thing. They need political cover. So we have to give them that political cover. We have to pick up the phone and call our legislators.
Are there families within the NTA family that agree with this, or are like, okay, that's cool?
Out of the, it was back to school, like, registration on Friday. We had hundreds of people walk by. I had 2 people tell me that they were not willing to write the letter. And they didn't say they were against us, they just said they didn't want to get involved.
I mean, I think there are, the overwhelming majority of people have spoken up from within the NTA community and outside the community have spoken up against this plan, because although we understand wanting to expand options for higher education in the neighborhood, there are other options there. Dunbar is down the street, 75% empty. So why are we duplicating resources and taking away resources, from
So the Prairie Avenue crowd doesn't want to send their children to Dunbar.
Well, the
They
funny
want
thing is,
something
when you
to
ask
fill
the
up the wardrobe.
families directly, the parents, they are willing to consider Dunbar as an option. So it makes me wonder, why is CPS so closed off to considering this?
So it's not even necessarily just the people. It may just be.
That's the crazy thing, because if you think about it, like, even if you look at these emails, it's one person. speaking for an entire community.
Real estate
which is
agent with
why
no kids in the school.
What is his name?
Tina Feldstein.
Tina Feldstein. She's a real estate agent. She doesn't have any
That's who
kids.
was exchanging the emails and who
Yes.
had the backdoor connection to.
And her
man.
sort of sidekick is John Jacoby, and the two of them are like the only people that they talk to. That was their version of community engagement.
Tina Feldstein?
Tina Feldstein.
And the thing is, if you actually talk to people in the South Loop, you explain all of this to them, you have a 50-50 shot of whether they're on your side. Because from their perspective, and I put it to them directly, I said, listen, if you were on the other end of the stick today, right, would you want this process to go through the way it went through? Because you don't know if it's going to be fair to you tomorrow. So do you believe in this? And they don't agree with the process at all. Even those who support the idea of, they want a shiny new high school. They don't like the process.
Well, we underestimate. I think I even shouldn't say we, but the city and its agencies forever underestimate the value of integrity in process. They focus so much on the outcome that they want, but the way that they get to the outcome has always had problems. This was the problem when they closed the 50 schools the first time. As I was involved in that process, and I remember the directive that we got was to design your ideal educational landscape. And then I know what happened after over a year of planning when we got to the board meeting and it was like, oh, actually, we're going to close 4 schools in your neighborhood. Okay. So there's no integrity in the process, and they underestimate the importance of that because it's not about doing what everybody wants all the time. It is about having enough respect for people, residents, taxpayers, to be upfront and forthright about what's happening, and then let them make their decision from there. But if everything is cloaked in secrecy, it's happening, it's predetermined because conversations have already happened, and it's only by forcing either through FOIA or repeated having to badger these people to get information, that's the only way you learn things. Of course there's no trust. And this is yet and still the pattern that they continue to roll out every time for everything in the city. No wonder why they get so much pushback on it.
And Tina Feldstein in particular, let's forget, the first CPS town hall meeting, and in case there's any doubt about whether or not she's behind this, she stood in front of these families, NTA families, and she said that this is one of her proudest moments as a South Loop community member. Because, to see this conversation finally happening.
And again, this is someone who has no connection to the school, but it has political connections.
And stands to make money.
Yeah,
because she's a real estate agent.
And we didn't even touch on, and I know this isn't the show that we can do this, but we didn't touch on the whole CPS's capital plan and where capital investments are made and which schools get the annexes and which communities get the new buildings versus those who do not. I mean, that's a whole other conversation.
And that's the thing with NTA. I think what's sad is that I've heard a lot of the families who are living in the ICT's housing development then say, well, when we saw NTA go up, we knew it wasn't for us, but we just didn't know when they would come to the lights. And that's the thing, you see this investment in the track and the pool and everything else, and that's what it is. It's, it's the things that can't black and brown just have anything nice.
And we kind of were talking about that earlier.
And that's understand that it's a need for this community as well, right? When you look at deaths from drowning, or the population that really needs swimming is huge. Every child in NTA learns how to swim. I mean, that's something, it might seem small, but there are not many other schools in the city where you can say that.
Are you all targeting and working to bring pressure to the Prairie Avenue District group?
We could maybe intensify that. We've maybe been a little bit.
Because this is about real estate. They're building those new towers on 12th Street.
Mm-hmm.
They've got to attract new families.
Yeah.
This is all
part of the plan.
Oh, yeah.
Part of the plan.
I mean, if their kids good enough to be singing Bodak Yellow, I'm sure they're good enough to be up in the damn school with them.
Right. Good morning, Chicago. This is Amara Enyia hosting from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. on this Labor Day on WVON 1690. I have in the studio with me co-hosting my brother Anton Seals, and we have been having a phenomenal, difficult conversation talking about the inequity in education in CPS, this attempt to close National Teachers Academy, a high-performing school that is predominantly Black, located in the South Loop community, and what this says about the larger philosophy that undergirds every action taken by CPS as well as taken by the city of Chicago. We have to have this conversation again. As I was mentioning while we were on the break, there's so much of this that we have not gotten into when it comes to resource allocation, capital expenditures for CPS, and how they perpetuate a lot of the issues that they claim to care about. And so this is we're going to have another show. I'm just going to put this out there. We'll have to have you both back on in the studio with us to talk more about that. But I wanted to take just the last few minutes of this segment to give you an opportunity to talk about some of those next steps, some of the things that you've done thus far, and what we can expect as this process continues to play out.
As far as next steps, Niketa can talk a little bit more about this, but I just want to say that, as we've been going through this process, it has been difficult, and we find ourselves putting out, they give us a new battle or a new fire to put out sometimes every couple weeks. And so the ways in which people can help, it's ever evolving. So one of the things that people can do to stay updated on our fight and to figure out how they can align with us and support us in this fight, there are 2 pages on Facebook, Chicagoans United for Equity. Please like that page and subscribe to the notifications on that page. We also have a page, We Are NTA, and we're constantly posting there and calling out to the community for different ways in which they can help us. And there's also wearenta.com if you are not on Facebook. And I also just want to add that we do hear the support from stations like WVON, the support from the larger community, and I, as a parent at NTA, on behalf of my children and the other families at NTA, just want to say thank you. We cannot thank you enough. We do hear you, and that means so much to us.
Yeah, I gotta say, I think one of the more nefarious parts of this process has been just seeing how CPS has been trying to put out this is a done deal in a different package every few weeks, right? So this is a done deal, we've got a new plan. Just about 10 days ago, they sent out this huge press release that even some of the reporters who were calling us for comment were saying, so this seems like nothing, but we're just calling because they put out a press release that said, okay, we're moving the plan forward. The reality is this is not a done deal. This is not going to be a done deal. We're not going to sit down. We're not going to stop fighting. That's what they want us to do, and we are absolutely not going to give in. So just so that you all know, we definitely want you involved in this fight. We're launching a letter writing campaign. We did our soft rollout last Thursday, and between Thursday and Friday, we had over 450 letters that were sent out to state legislators about this issue. Now, you might say, well, why are you choosing state legislators? To be honest, at a point where the mayor controls the city schools, and the city council, we really need to look at our state representatives, our state leaders, to come in and to advocate for us. And we've had some private conversations with some of our state leaders who have said they are with us. They're looking for the larger constituency, their voters, to call them, to write them, to let them know that, hey, they care about this issue. That'll give them the political cover they need to stand up.
Can I just also add, I think what you guys also potentially is this Prairie District Neighborhood Alliance also is a target. They are the group that moved for the expansion of Jones Commercial in the South Loop. That was the group. They are also the group who are now behind this current NTA piece. I think it is calls into question for us to have a kind of a larger, conversation with residents, because I think that there may be a difference between the people who live in the South Loop and the leadership who have assumed leadership in the South Loop, which is a newly created neighborhood, right? It used to be called the Low End. It was part of Bronzeville at one point in time, right? It was the forgotten area, right? And there's a history and a context that goes there. And I think what is currently happening is a whitewashing, right? And intertwined in that is this class issue, because they are expanding in the South Loop, right? They are looking to attract more people, more multi-racial folks who are coming from all over the globe insert them into these new, pristine institutions that are not run or reflect the real Chicago, right? But a new manufactured Chicago, the way they see it. So I think having that kind of exchange and directing some of your advocacy towards that group would be probably really impactful.
That's absolutely true, Anton, and I think that there are a lot of people who live in the South Loop neighborhood who would say strongly that the Prairie District Neighborhood Alliance does not represent them. It does not represent their desires. This is not the process that they would want either, but we need to hear those voices. We need you to speak louder.
And as I'm reading through some of the comments that are coming in, I do want to, just for the listening audience, to understand this issue beyond what's happening at NTA. Again, NTA is a microcosm of what's been happening in CPS more broadly. We also have to shine a light on what's happening in the classrooms. So the kind of curriculum that our students are getting access to, the stripping of arts programming from schools, or seeing art as a luxury. I made a comment a few days ago about the fact that we've got schools with no libraries, and certainly schools with no librarians. So the number that I used, I think, was 162 schools that have no libraries. 142 of those serve Black and brown kids. And of those, we don't even know how many have actual librarians. So there's this notion that things like access to technology, access to libraries, access to arts programs are considered a luxury for certain groups. Again, those groups that aren't valued. But in our number one schools, the ones that we tout nationally, that they're number one, Peyton is number one, I think, according to some recent survey that came out. Well, there's a reason why they're doing well, because you see the level of investment in those schools. So to me, it's mind-boggling to see that we're saying you can have a district where you have the number one school in the country, and then you have schools that are at the complete opposite end of the spectrum. And the underlying factor is investment. If you invest in a school, if you see children in those schools as deserving of access to arts programming, access to libraries, access to technology, then we would make those investments in those schools, and they would be high-performing schools. But what we have is a systematic disinvestment in schools and communities that are not valued, and it creates this disparity in terms of the quality of education, where now you can't go to a school in your neighborhood. I can't go to a school and hope and expect that it will be quality in my neighborhood because of where I live. And that is, to me, shameful, yet it characterizes what's been happening in this district for years.
Well, are they manipulating? Maybe the question is also that they are manipulating this kind of tension, I think, potentially in communities when we start talking about what's good for the public. You know what I mean? I think that is also kind of at the core of what you're kind of getting at, is that that's why the importance of this narrative that certain people and groups are undeserving of a certain kind of, like, that's at the heart of what's happening in Chicago around violence, and why the media has, been like a really kind of push-pull kind of situation between, pushing to have your voices heard and pulling to kind of drag these stories and lifting these stories out around the violence, the kind of culture of Chicago that is deemed unworthy or un-American in a way. Right? So now just listening to you all, it becomes like that the impact of that is that you no longer, that these people, all of us lumped on the west side, on the south side of Chicago, in Black and brown neighborhoods, are all part of this problem.
Yes.
Right? That people are buying into across the race spectrum, right? But it's thrust basically by the white power structure that clearly defines and believes that, even if they don't consciously know, which I find hard to believe, but even if they don't consciously know.
I mean, that's part of their privilege, is to not have to think about it.
Right. I mean, yeah, and I think that's, this kind of sense of privilege, but at the core of it is around what you talked about earlier, which is institutions.
Yes.
Around maintaining a white, male, patriarchal narrative of control. And I think, like, if you talk about that in theory, like, yeah, but the way it plays out is like, when I come for your school, I can send the mayor an email. He's going to respond because I got 35 to 100 people who are going to write checks for him when he runs for mayor again. Yeah. And he's going to listen to us. Yeah. And what you all going to have to do is figure that out. You get the short end of the stick, essentially. And I don't want to have to be the bearer of bad news, but that's the way it is. Yeah. And tough cookie, right? And until I think people who are on the other end of that tough cookie stand up and say, I'm going to take my cookie crumbs and I'm going to stick it to you, right? Because that is, in theory, the power of democracy, and you have to build on that. And that's hard work.
Yeah. Can we talk about how the mayor took the time to attend an Easter egg roll in Prairie District neighborhood, which is where he had this conversation with Tina Feldstein, the president of the Prairie District Neighborhood Alliance. but you haven't set foot in National Teachers Academy to see what's going on in the school that you decided you could just give away and shut down?
Well, I would say that's par for the course. But that would launch me into a whole other conversation about the priorities of this city's leadership. I would say the priorities and the hypocrisy, but I'll leave it there. You guys have to come back into the studio. I definitely want to keep up with how things are progressing. For those of you who are just tuning in, I'm in the studio with Niketa Brar of Chicagoans United for Equity and Hannah El-Amin of National Teachers Academy, a parent at National Teachers Academy. If you can, please follow them. They're on social media. We are NTA. Anything that you can do to support this cause, join the letter writing campaign, attend the regular meetings that are held on this issue. We will definitely, on our end, be following very closely to really see what happens and to make sure that we're holding people accountable for what's going on in CPS. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to switch gears and talk about another community issue dealing with community benefits agreements with the Obama Presidential Center coming to the city of Chicago, and those who've been at the front lines of that whole piece and how that is playing out in the city of Chicago. So again, we will be right back.
Happy Labor Day from the talk of Chicago, 1690.
Thank you guys so much. You guys are awesome. So for all my viewing audience, we had, and I'm going to flip this so you can see, hopefully you can see everyone, Niketa Brar and Hannah El-Amin from Chicagoans United for Equity and National Teachers Academy, really at the front lines doing this work, fighting the good fight. And so we have to give them cover. We also have to give them support. And Anton, you already know what the deal is. So,
Thank you,
yeah.
guys. Thank you. I have you locked in the next guest.
Okay.
You have to just go out the side door whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay. So it's going to be a little bit of downtime before we get our next guest in the studio.
Oh, they're coming in?
Stay tuned. He's actually not. He's on the line.
Thank you.
So we'll be right back. Stay tuned.
You guys are on it. I mean, like, you all have the videos out, everything else.
Well, I gotta run down. I would have my little scorecard of like an actual faction.
That's what I got hoping for. Is that okay?
I'm sending it all.
I want you to speak with that.
I have to fresh
You're
up.
so good at it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again.
You guys, whatever you can do, you already know.
So is the determination now that they are going to close it? Is the school year coming up?
All right, guys. So I am going to. We're going to our last segment, and unfortunately we won't be because it's going to be a call-in interview. So you probably won't be able to hear the audio as much as if you were in the studio. But we're going to be talking to. Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry, I'm talking to the viewers. So we're going to end the conversation here. We have Juwanta Malone from COCO, who's part of a coalition, the Obama Presidential Center. We're going to be talking about the community benefits agreements process, which I am a part of, advocating for community benefits agreements, which quite frankly should be a part of every large-scale development project in the city of Chicago. In this particular case, this is an opportunity to show that we can do development without displacement, in my opinion. And what does that look like? And how do we envision community transformation in a way that actually benefits the existing community? So we have Juwanta Malone, who's coming from an action that's taking place downtown. He'll be on the phone with us talking about this issue. We will have a follow-up conversation, and we'll be bringing more of them into the studio on another show that I'll be doing. But I'm going to end the conversation here. I hope you enjoy this conversation. This is critical. We talked about transit equity and bike equity in the city of Chicago in the first hour with Obai and Jamal. Thank you so much, from Slow Roll Chicago. And then in this last hour, we were talking with Chicagoans United for Equity and parents from National Teachers Academy on the education issues in the city of Chicago. So this is the show for today. Thank you for tuning in. Feel free to continue to leave your comments and questions. This is an ongoing conversation, so we will be taking it from here. So thanks for tuning in. Share the video if you can, and stay tuned for the next time when I'm hosting, and we'll be bringing you, as usual, substantive conversations on the issues that you care about. So thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll be back soon.